The first thing I noticed was the sound. A deep, muffled thunk followed by a scraping noise, like a shovel hitting something solid underground. At first, I thought it was coming from down the street, maybe some city workers doing maintenance. But as I lay there in bed, still groggy from sleep, the sound didn't fade. It got louder, closer, more insistent. I sat up, frowning. That was my yard. Throwing on a hoodie, I made my way to the front door, squinting against the bright morning sun. And that's when I saw her. Karen, the HOA president, standing in my yard, shoveling up my lawn like it owed her money. A couple of other board members stood nearby, arms crossed, watching like they were supervising some grand renovation project. "What the hell are you doing?" I called out, stepping onto the porch. Karen barely looked up. "Fixing a violation." I blinked, still trying to process the sight of my lawn being torn apart by the world's most insufferable woman. "A violation?" I repeated. "That's my sprinkler system." Karen sighed dramatically, as if she were the victim in this situation. "Your pipes are above the HOA's aesthetic guidelines." She punctuated the statement with another aggressive shove of her shovel into the dirt. "Exposed irrigation systems are an eyesore." I rubbed my temples, willing myself to stay calm. "Karen, the sprinklers are underground." She rolled her eyes. "Not the sprinklers, the pipes. The ones that run too close to the surface." I looked down at the mess she had already made. The top layer of my lawn was gone in spots, revealing the black tubing that carried water to my sprinkler heads. It wasn't even visible unless you really went looking for it, which, apparently, Karen had. "You can't just show up and dig up my property," I said, stepping closer. "This is—" A loud hiss cut me off. Karen froze, her shovel halfway through another scoop of dirt. The board members took an involuntary step back. Then came the gurgling. A deep, ominous rumble, like something waking up beneath the earth. Karen barely had time to let out a confused, "Huh?" before the ground beneath her erupted. A geyser of water shot into the air, drenching her instantly. She shrieked, stumbling back, her perfectly pressed blouse clinging to her like a second skin. The board members scrambled away, shielding themselves from the spray. I could only stare. Karen coughed, sputtering as she wiped water from her face. "What the—" She didn't get to finish. Because the moment her shovel had broken through the tubing, she had unknowingly severed a connection to something much bigger than my sprinkler system. The water wasn't stopping. It kept surging, higher and higher, pressure building like a small-scale Old Faithful. And then I realized what had happened. "Karen," I said, barely suppressing a laugh, "you just dug into a city water main." Her eyes widened in horror. And just like that, I knew today was going to be fun. Karen stood there, dripping wet, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The water kept gushing from the ruptured pipe, spraying in every direction. My lawn, once neatly trimmed, was now turning into a small lake, the soil unable to keep up with the flood. The other HOA board members had backed away, their smug confidence replaced with something closer to panic. One of them, Greg, who always voted in favor of Karen's ridiculous policies, was the first to speak. I think we should call someone," he muttered. "No kidding, Greg," I said, watching as Karen tried to compose herself. She wiped water from her eyes, her signature short blonde bob now plastered to her face. This is not my fault." I let out a dry laugh. "Oh no? Because I'm pretty sure you were the one holding the shovel." She pointed at me, shaking with rage, or maybe from the cold water soaking through her clothes. "You installed an illegal system." "This wouldn't have happened if you followed regulations." "Illegal?" I raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it was installed by a licensed contractor and approved by the city. You just dug up something you had no business touching." Greg looked between us nervously. Should we shut it off?" "Great idea, Greg," I said, crossing my arms. "Where's the shut-off valve?" Greg looked at Karen. Karen looked at the gushing water. The realization hit her a second later. "I don't know," she admitted. I sighed, already regretting my morning. "Right, because it's a city water main, which means the shutoff isn't on my property." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "That's impossible. I checked the property records before." Before she destroyed my lawn? Before she made an absolute fool of herself? Before she committed what was probably a huge legal violation? I didn't bother asking. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started dialing. "Yeah, I'm calling the city, I announced, making sure my voice was loud enough for the board members to hear. And I suggest you call your lawyer. Karen gasped. That is completely unnecessary. Really? I gestured at the fire hydrant level water pressure currently turning my front yard into a swamp. You sure about that? Greg was already stepping farther back, as if he didn't want any part of what was happening. The other board members muttered something about needing to check the bylaws and made their escape, leaving Karen standing alone in a rapidly expanding puddle. City Water Department, what's your emergency? A voice said on the other end of my call. I stepped out of Karen's earshot, but not before throwing her one last smirk. Yeah, hi. I'd like to report an HOA president who just dug into a water main and flooded my yard. Karen let out an outraged squeak. I did not flood your yard. I held up a hand to silence her, still talking to the city rep. Oh, and you might want to send a crew fast. The water's still going. Karen let out a frustrated growl, clenching her fists. This is slander. You can't just... I turned my back on her. Yeah, I'll hold. Thanks. As the water kept rising, Karen's next words were lost beneath the sound of her own mistake crashing down around her. Karen was still fuming, standing knee-deep in the growing flood when the city water department finally picked up again. Yes, hi, I said into the phone, stepping away from her screeching. I need an emergency shut-off. Someone, I shot Karen a look, dug into a water main, and now my front yard is a small lake. The city rep on the other end let out a low sigh, the kind that suggested this wasn't the first time some idiot had done this. Address? I rattled it off while Karen stomped through the water, arms flailing. This is not my fault. You shouldn't have had an unauthorized system. For the last time, Karen, I said, barely holding on to my patience, it was authorized. By the city. I turned my attention back to the phone. How fast can someone get here? We'll dispatch a crew immediately. But just so you know, the rep hesitated. If someone outside of city personnel damaged that main, the responsible party could be looking at fines, possibly legal action. I grinned. Oh, I know. Karen must have caught the tail end of that because her already furious expression turned absolutely murderous. You wouldn't dare. I put a hand over the receiver and smirked. Wouldn't I? Before she could launch into another fit, the distant sound of sirens cut through the air. Karen and I both turned toward the road just in time to see a city utility truck and a police cruiser pulling up. The board members who had previously made themselves scarce were now peeking out from behind hedges and front porches, watching the disaster unfold. Greg, ever the coward, was pretending to check his phone like he hadn't been here the whole time. Two city workers stepped out of the truck, one of them wearing a bright orange vest with City Water Department in bold letters. His eyes flickered from the geyser in my yard to Karen, who was still standing in the water, her designer flats completely ruined. Jesus, he muttered. All right, where's the shutoff? I shrugged. You tell me. I wasn't the one who decided to dig up a perfectly functional system. That got his attention. Wait, someone dug into this? Before I could answer, Karen stepped forward, soaking wet but still somehow managing to radiate indignation. This system was in violation of HOA guidelines. I was correcting an issue. The city worker gave her a look that was equal parts confused and annoyed. Ma'am, this isn't just a sprinkler system. You dug into a municipal water supply. Karen paled. Well, how was I supposed to know that? The second city worker scoffed. Because you're not supposed to dig up water lines at all, he turned to his partner. Get the shutoff. This is going to be a nightmare. The first worker nodded and jogged toward the curb where he popped open a city utility access point. Within seconds, the geyser in my yard sputtered, then slowly died down until all that was left was a massive muddy pit. The police officer who had been watching quietly finally stepped forward. So, who's responsible for this mess? Every set of eyes turned to Karen. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Greg, the snake, suddenly found a fascinating spot on his shoe. The rest of the board shuffled awkwardly. Finally, Karen huffed, crossing her arms. This is being blown out of proportion. The officer raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, you damaged city property. That's not something we just blow out of proportion. I leaned back, arms crossed, enjoying every second of this. Hey, Karen, I think you might need a lawyer after all. Karen's face was a spectacular shade of red, somewhere between rage and humiliation. The water had stopped, but the damage was done, literally. My once pristine lawn was now a swampy disaster zone, with mud pooling around her feet like quicksand waiting to swallow her whole. The city worker who had shut off the water main wiped his hands on his vest and exhaled loudly. "All right," he muttered, looking between Karen and me. "Who exactly gave permission for this excavation?" Karen, in her infinite arrogance, lifted her chin. "As HOA president, I have the authority to enforce neighborhood guidelines." The worker blinked. "That's not what I asked." He turned to the police officer. "Did she pull a permit for this?" The officer, a tall, no-nonsense-looking guy with a badge that read Sankant Wilkes, pulled out a notepad. "We'll get to that," he said, flipping to a fresh page. "First, I need to understand exactly what happened here." He turned his sharp gaze to me. "You the homeowner?" I nodded. "Yep, and I woke up this morning to find Karen here, digging up my property without my permission." Wilkes' expression darkened. "That true, ma'am?" Karen squared her shoulders. "I was enforcing HOA regulations. His sprinkler system was a violation." The city worker let out a disbelieving snort. "Lady, this isn't a sprinkler issue. You cracked open a city water main." Karen crossed her arms tightly, but she was definitely sweating now. "Well, it wasn't marked. How was I supposed to know it was a city line?" The second city worker, who had been taking pictures of the damage, scoffed. "Because you're supposed to call the city before you dig. There are laws about this." He shook his head. "You ever heard of 811? The hotline that literally exists to prevent people from doing exactly what you just did?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. I smirked. Guess that step wasn't in the HOA handbook. Wilkes made a few more notes. "So just to be clear, you, an HOA president with no excavation experience, no permits, and no authorization, took it upon yourself to dig up someone's yard." Karen hesitated. I was fixing a violation." Wilkes didn't look impressed. "No, ma'am. You were destroying city property." Karen started to panic. "This is ridiculous. It's his yard. Why is the city even involved?" The city worker laughed. "Because you just tampered with municipal infrastructure. That's not some backyard plumbing job. That's a public utility. You might as well have taken a wrench to a fire hydrant." Wilkes tucked his notepad away and let out a slow breath. "All right, here's what's going to happen." He looked at me. "City will assess the damage. If your lawn needs repairs beyond just refilling the hole, keep all receipts. If your property value is impacted, get an estimate." I nodded. Gladly. Then he turned to Karen. "And you?" She stiffened, eyes darting around like she was searching for an escape route. "You're looking at multiple violations. Illegal excavation, destruction of city property, and possibly even trespassing, depending on how the homeowner wants to proceed." Karen gasped. "This is insane." Wilkes shrugged. "Tell it to the judge." Karen stood frozen, her wet clothes clinging to her like the last remnants of her dignity. The board members, who had once stood proudly beside her, were now inching away, clearly wanting no part of the legal mess she had just landed in. Sergeant Wilkes tapped his notepad against his palm, letting the weight of his words settle. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." Karen's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." The city worker crossed his arms. "We're completely serious. You dug into a city water main without checking with the city, destroyed public infrastructure, and flooded private property. That's not just an oopsie. It's illegal." I couldn't help but grin. "But hey, at least you enforced those HOA regulations, right?" Karen shot me a glare that could have melted steel, but she was too busy trying to salvage what was left of her situation. This isn't fair. I was only trying to maintain neighborhood standards. How was I supposed to know the water main was there?" Greg, ever the coward, finally spoke up from behind her. Karen, maybe we should just, handle this through legal channels?" Karen spun to face him, looking betrayed. "You're just going to stand there and let them humiliate me?" Greg raised his hands in surrender. "I didn't tell you to start digging, Karen." A flicker of realization crossed her face. She was truly alone in this. Wilkes let out a long sigh. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But one way or another, we're going to need an official statement. And depending on what the city wants to do, there could be fines, maybe more." Karen clenched her fists, her shoulders rising and falling with short, angry breaths. "This is unbelievable." Wilkes pulled out a form from his pocket. "You're free to call a lawyer if you want, but I strongly suggest cooperating. City damages alone could be thousands of dollars." Karen's face twisted in frustration, but the fight was draining out of her. She knew she was screwed. She could argue with neighbors and strong-arm the HOA board, but she couldn't bully the law. Finally, she huffed. "Fine, but I'm not saying anything without legal representation." Wilkes nodded. "That's your right." He turned to the city workers. "We'll need a full report of the damages. I'll be following up." The workers nodded before one of them turned to me. "We'll send someone out to assess your property. If your landscaping needs repairs, we'll make sure she foots the bill." I smirked. Music to my ears. As the officer led Karen toward his patrol car, she shot me one last look, her face a mix of fury and embarrassment. "You think this is funny?" I shrugged. "A little." She scoffed, but didn't have a comeback. As the sirens faded into the distance, Greg and the rest of the board quietly dispersed, avoiding eye contact like kids sneaking out after breaking a window. I took one last look at the muddy mess that had once been my lawn and sighed. It was going to be a pain to fix, but honestly, totally worth it.